Welcome to Saving America. This is Dr. David D. Schein, professor, associate dean, attorney, consultant, author of Decline of America, 100 Years of Leadership Failures. And our special broadcasts include usually 3 segments, and we'll do that today. We're going to talk about In the News, and then we're going to talk about Rumor of the Week, and we're going to follow that with Just the Facts. And today we have a special guest, Andrea Whitberg, who is a great writer. She is currently with the American Thinker, writes a bunch of really fascinating and well-written columns, and I highly recommend her to you, and we'll give you more of her bio when we introduce her in just a few minutes.
You say A, and that's your final answer?
But first, let's talk about what's in the news, and it's pretty interesting stuff. And we've got a judge has blocked enforcement of Biden's attempt to loosen the southern border. I'm still really not sure what he's got in mind. Flooding the United States with generally low-wage workers at a time when we've got a COVID pandemic and we have record unemployment at the moment, does not seem like the best way to get things done in the United States. Does not seem to be a way to help the country. And it's indeed a very disconcerting situation. So I'm hopeful that the courts will continue to support law and order. I also want to mention a disturbing situation is that the Biden cats are claiming that the cages were part of the Trump administration's interference in the southern border. And the reality, of course, is that it is well documented that the cages, as they're called, came out during the Obama-Biden administration. And actually, by reducing immigration into the United States, illegals into the United States, the Trump administration improved the program and tried to reduce such sad circumstances. And oddly enough, the Biden administration is reopening some of the Obama-Biden facilities in anticipation of more illegals who do not have a place to go and are not presently employable in the United States for a variety of reasons. So a pretty interesting situation. But again, do not forget that this was the Obama administration mess, and they've brought it back, as so much of Biden's activities are merely a rehash of the failed Obama policy.
Well, the weakest link. Goodbye.
So what do we have for a rumor today? Well, we've got all sorts of good stuff. Rumor is that Governor Cuomo, one of my least favorite people on earth, other than Chucky Schumer, coming from New York, is that now that a third woman has come forward claiming sexual harassment against the governor and a federal indictment possibly for criminally negligent reporting of deaths in nursing homes, that he may be in quite big trouble. So it'd be quite interesting to see what happens there. But I think the key rumor of the week ought to be Biden's growing visibility of incompetence. He did a couple presentations over the weekend, forgot names of well-known politicians, literally said, "Where am I? What's going on?" And he couldn't remember that 500,000 people have died from COVID to this point. Had to pull a card out of his wallet. We're not sure what else was in that card. But of course, you know, the president of the United States doesn't need to carry cash, doesn't need to have a wallet. And I'm not sure why a person, if they are competent, could not remember the number 500,000, especially since just the day before he had held a ceremony regarding the death of 500 Americans due to the Chinese Communist Party spread virus, which is still not a fully resolved situation, although things do seem to be getting better due to Trump's administration, Operation Warp Speed. That was not a Biden development, although he seems to be very eager to take credit for something that he did not do. So I think it's a pretty interesting situation with Biden's, who was kept under wraps largely during the campaign because everybody knew he didn't have the endurance, he couldn't stand up to Trump. Reportedly, the two debates where he went against Trump, slept most of the day and then just showed up for the debate, worked off planned answers to questions that he was fed on a softball basis. And of course, virtually everybody concedes that he lost the second debate as he was clearly not up to it. So in any event, the Dems, I think, have played their card here. There is now a proposal to limit the president's war powers. And I think that's a big hint, folks, that the Dems know that Biden is not competent and is not likely to survive this administration. Now, I think this may present a very special opportunity in America today, which is to invoke the 25th Amendment in an interesting way, to go to judges around the United States, many of whom were appointed by Trump, many of whom were not nutcases, and to say, Biden signed all of these executive orders, but he's not competent. So can we disregard all of his executive orders because the person who signed them was not competent? Something to think about.
Just the facts, ma'am.
Welcome to our third section for today's Saving America, and we are very honored to have Andrea Widberg with us today, and she's got a great and fascinating background as a conservative columnist for the American Thinker, because she started over in the liberal capital of the country, the San Francisco Bay Area, specifically did her undergrad at Berkeley, University of California, Berkeley, famously one of the most liberal campuses in the United States, parallel to where I did my liberal undergraduate over at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, kind of a balancing act of the two coasts. And I, however, was already a conservative before I got to Penn, and it made it a very unpleasant experience. So, and Andrea has an interesting path, because then she came over to our neck of the woods here in Houston, Texas, was up the road at the University of Texas Law School, and then went back to the West Coast and raised some kids and did some other interesting things as an attorney, and has turned to full-time writing. And we are just, I am such a huge fan of her columns. And she did one in this past week on the Equality Act, or as I call it, the Inequality Act. And I just had to have her come on to Saving America in our Just the Facts section to talk about the damage that this law, if passed, might do to the United States. And Andrea, welcome, and tell us a little bit about the proposed law.
Well, thank you. I have the text here, pardon me for looking away from the camera. The text of the proposed law is, of course, very long, but congress.gov has a helpful summary. And superficially, it sounds just like a repeat of the usual government civil rights, no discrimination. It prohibits discrimination based on sex, sexual orientation. So it's not anymore about race or creed or whatever. And gender identity. Those are the magic words. In areas including public accommodation facilities, education, federal funding, employment, housing, credit, and the jury system. And it says the bill prohibits an individual from being denied access to a shared facility, including a restroom, a locker room, and a dressing room, that is in accordance with the individual's gender identity. Now, gender identity is a very specific term, because we are talking what someone wakes up in the morning and claims to be. So this, for women, this very specifically refers to biological males. It does not mean someone who has gone through the chemical and physical mutilation of transformation into a person of the opposite sex. I should say here, I do not believe that transgenderism is real. I believe that it is a form of body dysphoria in the same way anorexia is. When someone who weighs 100 pounds soaking wet claims I'm morbidly obese and starts starving herself to death, we do not give her diet pills and stomach stapling. What we do is say that there is a mind-body disconnect, and we work together to align her mind and body to the reality that she's not morbidly obese. In the same way, with people who claim to be the opposite sex, instead of cutting off their vital organs or sexual organs and giving them chemicals that cause cancer and sterility and stuff, we should be perhaps popping up their own chemicals. So a man who thinks he's a woman should maybe have some testosterone. A woman who thinks she's a man, maybe some estrogen, and align them. So I think it's insanely cruel what we're doing to young people. And it's also creating a fantasy. And so this fantasy comes out with gender identity. You are what you say you are. If I were to announce to you right now that I am a giant green lizard, I expect you to treat me that way and call me Your Majesty the giant green lizard. That's essentially what the transgenderism is. And so what they're saying is when someone announces they are a certain sex, they automatically get access to everything that comes with that sex. Now, I will say some of these people really believe it. They're just living in a world of fantasy. A law like this is going to create a gold mine for opportunists. And in a world where transgenderism is feted, it's not a matter anymore of no boy would ever admit that he thinks he's a girl or wear dresses or anything. It's becoming a thing. At high schools, I read somewhere as many as 1 in 6 young people are now announcing they're transgender. And this has gone up from a few years ago when it was less than 2% of the population was transgender. Suddenly we have, 15% claiming transgenderism. Very disturbing. So the law, if passed, would mean that men have unlimited access, if they say I'm a woman, to locker rooms, bathrooms, women's prisons facilities. And that's been a problem in England already, where men rapists are announcing they're women and getting put in women's prisons.
Oh my goodness. Yeah,
So
that doesn't sound like a good track. So you're saying one of the things that I hadn't thought about is the impact on prisons and jails, because there's a lot of tough customers over there, and I didn't think about that as a potential ramification, and obviously a serious one. Obviously, the restroom situation is huge. As the father of a daughter and 2 beautiful granddaughters who are not quite to puberty yet, the thought of some man going into a restroom where my granddaughters or my daughter are using the facilities is just immediately disturbing to me. One of the things I heard about this bill is that moving past just the issue of transgenderism is the issue of adoptions. And as you know, this has been a very controversial issue across the United States, is that, for instance, Catholic adoption agencies, and I understand historically that the Catholic Church and some of the other religious organizations were some of the very first adoption agencies across the world to try and help these parentless children. And they do try to put children with biologically opposite parents, I guess we'd say, or biologically appropriate parents per their religious beliefs. And I understand that might be prohibited under this law.
yeah, what's very interesting is that we have explicit rights under the Bill of Rights. Religious freedom is one, but all these gender laws, and for example, the Supreme Court saying that same-sex marriage is a constitutional right, and we are facing a huge collision between explicit constitutional rights and the constitutional rights that the Supreme Court is creating out of whole cloth. And the other problem with this bill, as many people are speaking about, is that it erases women in athletics. And several years ago, there was a woman, mixed martial arts fighter, who went up against a man. She said it was the most frightening experience in her life, and that was before he shattered her eye socket with a single punch to her face. In Australia, on the women's rugby, there's a person called Hannah Momsey, who's I think 6 foot, 220 pounds, and was playing women's rugby because he announced that he was female. And let me say, I have tremendous compassion for people who have this as a mental illness, who feel that they are trapped in the wrong body. I mean, I'd love to say, oh, Marilyn Monroe trapped in my body. It's awful to be ill at ease in your own skin. I get that, but it doesn't mean that society has to bow down to that tragic delusion. But I had an interesting thought last night, apropos the Constitution and imaginary constitutional rights. Regarding abortion, I'm not going to get into pro-choice or not. I will simply say that it should always have been a states' rights decision because it's not explicitly part of the Constitution. But the Supreme Court in '73 came up with a right to privacy that was from penumbras and emanations, and it articulated a constitutional right that's not in the Constitution. And very explicitly, it articulated a right to privacy that women have in their own bodies. And I'm rather wondering how it is that they're going to square the circle of telling women who don't want to be with a biologically whole male who identifies as a female but claims he's a lesbian. And I've known of people like that. I don't know how they're going to square the circle of saying women have no right to privacy in locker rooms and bathrooms and prison cells, their integrity of their own body, announced in 1973 by the Supreme Court with this new inequality law. So it's going to be interesting, to say the least, what's coming down the line.
Andrea, that is an incredibly interesting connection that I had honestly not thought about. And I, as we talked about, I'm a huge fan of women's rights, and I'm the work in a business school, and we have more women than men in business school. We have more women than men in law school today. We're not quite at parity at medical schools, but I think we're rapidly approaching parity. Statistics last year that were 55% of college graduates were female. That's actually not good for our society.
It's
what
terrible.
we're running into is the women don't have men who match up with them. And I've heard women say, I don't want to marry some schlub who's working down at the car wash. I want a college graduate who matches up with me. So some interesting developments. I heard another piece of this that I hadn't thought about before, and that is that there's something called SWAM set-aside, small women and minority businesses. And I wonder if a guy like me, and I have a small business, and so I come under the S, but S doesn't get you a lot. You really need to be either a W or an M. And I'm sure many married couples have the wife listed as the owner, even if it's the husband's business, because they want to come under the W set aside, the SWAM set aside. So I wonder what the impact would be if I decided dressed just like I am today, I think, fairly traditional male dress, and said, I identify as a woman for the purpose of my SWAM application to do consulting for the city of Houston. What do you think about that?
I think you could get away with it, although I don't think you could do it. I identify as a woman for purposes of business. You would have to say, I identify as a woman in all areas of my life, including, and people would say, well, you're still married to a woman. And you would say, I identify as a lesbian. And people are doing that. And years ago, someone, I knew her father, a genuinely mentally confused man, after her mother died, he showed up in full drag regalia and said that he was going to have a sex change because he always was a woman. He knew that. And she saw him later. He hadn't had the sex change, and he was dressed back in dad clothes, normal clothes, and announced that he had decided he was a lesbian and it was easier to get women when they thought he was a man.
Oh my gosh.
So this kind of confusion, again, it is tragic. I mean, at an individual level, it's tragic. At a societal level, the tragedy is imposing that kind of mental confusion and body dysphoria on society at large, announcing that it's law. Women who can no longer compete in sports, it closes them out of college athletics. Now, I have to say, I am not in favor of any time government puts its thumb on the scale, these small women in my businesses and minority-owned businesses. I think a healthy government stays out of this. And a lot of things in society would shake out and normalize if the marketplace rather than the government was calling the shots. The government should be a policeman preventing discrimination, not an activist deciding who wins and loses.
Yes, well, that's great. Andrea, as you know, we try and keep these segments to a certain length, and you and I could definitely do this for the next 2 hours. So maybe we'll have to get one of those NPR specials and line up a couple of people and have a great debate. But I am so appreciative of your providing some of your time today and sharing some of your thoughts on this very disturbing bill that I think contains, unfortunately, despite its title, a great deal of negatives for our society. And, you know, my own opinion is it sets back 50 years of women's progress in America. And I really appreciate some of your interesting sidelights on this, because it is something that we're going to have to deal with. And I'm hoping we're going to deal with it at this stage and not have to deal with it after it gets passed. And as Nancy Pelosi famously said, you know, you'll have to pass it to find out how bad it really is.
Yes.
This could definitely be that. So again, this has been Saving America for this week. And again, thanks to our guest, Andrea Whitberg, writer for the American Thinker, and has become my favorite political writer. And I encourage you to check out her columns. The Epoch news system carries a lot of her pieces, and so you might find it there if you don't find it directly on the American Thinker. And as always, all the opinions expressed here are my own and of my guest. They do not reflect on my university or my other business interests. And please join us again for another exciting episode of Saving America.